Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, Bleak. Today I want to be talking to you guys all about the Kouri Richins trial. Now I know there's been a lot of content coming out about the case. I know that 2020 is doing an episode, all the usual Dateline. A lot of YouTubers have done like live court watching and stuff. Well, the case is over and we've gotten a verdict and everything. And I've been wanting to cover it for a long time. I know a lot of you found me because of Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively. Don't worry, I am planning on continuing to cover that case. It's been kind of quiet lately. I'm very surprised the judge has not ruled on the summary judgment. And hopefully that'll be coming soon and we can talk about that. But in the meantime, my roots really are in true crime. My sister and I had a podcast. The podcast is called Bleak, which is the name of my channel, is called Bleak Pod. And all those episodes, I think we did like 15 or so episodes. You can find those on my channel. That was all true crime, and we covered a wide variety of cases from recently to quite a long time ago. So anyway, this is kind of getting back into the true crime stuff, which is definitely a big part of what this channel is about. But with Kouri Richins, I wanted to be kind of methodical and specific about what aspects of it I want to cover, because I don't want to just regurgitate what everybody else is doing and saying. So a couple of things, you guys probably don't know a whole lot about me personally, but I worked as an RN for close to 15 years. Currently I have 4 kids, and so I am staying home with them, and I still do a lot of like gig work on the side, but I'm not currently working as a nurse, but I have a lot of experience in the nursing field. I worked on a surgical floor for most of that time on a neurosurgery unit. I was a charge nurse. Anyway, so the reason I bring that up is because there is a lot of medical evidence in this case, in my opinion. When it comes to like Eric Richin's toxicology and the medical examiner's report and what the significance of all of that is. And I do think I can provide some insight into that, which is one of the things I want to focus on. So just to give you kind of an overview up front, I want to talk about, so I've seen a lot of particularly defense attorney run YouTube channels talking about with the Kouri Richins verdict. She was found guilty on all charges, which everybody knows by now, I'm sure. But they were surprised that she was convicted of the attempted murder charge, which was the poisoned sandwich that she supposedly, or I don't have to say supposedly anymore because she's been convicted of it, which is nice. So the sandwich that she had tried to poison him with on Valentine's Day. And they don't think that the evidence was there for that, and they just thought that the jury would maybe come back not guilty on that one, but guilty on the other ones. But I want to talk, so I'm going to start off by talking about why I would be comfortable convicting on that particular charge, and I think some of the medical evidence kind of plays into that a little bit. And then I want to talk about the medical examiner phone call that Kouri had with the medical examiner. A little detail I noticed that I don't think I've ever seen anybody else talk about, that, and again, it's just a little thing, but it's something I noticed and I found it to be important and a little incriminating. And then last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about, I do think a lot of true crime in general, there's a lot of defense attorneys on YouTube who I think they're mistakenly, when they're talking about these cases, right, they always seem to say that there's reasonable doubt even when there's a ton of evidence against somebody. And I think they're incorrectly presenting to the public a beyond all doubt standard, not a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. And I think it's unfortunately because you have a platform that's reaching tons of people that are potential jurors. I think it's a dangerous precedence to set, and I want to talk about that. So that's just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be talking about. If any of that interests you, you can stick around. If not, no harm, no foul. I will not be offended. Anyway, and I won't know anyway, right? So going back to the first thing I said I would talk about, the attempted murder charge with the sandwich. So The sandwich poisoning, a couple of reasons why I think the arguments where people are like, oh, he could have just been having like a general reaction to it, or he could have just like gotten a stomach ache. First of all, Kouri Richins, because I want to back it up with evidence, Kouri Richins purchased drugs, and I'm not saying fentanyl, because she purchased drugs from Carmen Lauber a few days before the Valentine's Day sandwich. Now, my understanding, based on the evidence of the trial, was she purchases drugs. She just tells Carmen Lauber she wants pain pills. Initially, she is given oxycodone or something, some variety like that. Just to give you guys a little, and again, some of you may know this, but I'm guessing you probably wouldn't unless you're either into drugs or you're a medical person. The Oxy Blues that they sell on the street are typically 30 milligram oxycodone pills. 30 milligrams is a really pretty hefty dose of oxycodone. To give you an idea, if you're hospitalized for surgery, let's say, I've had 4 C-sections, so like after a C-section, I would have be able to get 5 to 10 milligrams of oxycodone like every 4 to 6 hours. Okay, so those little white pills are 5 milligrams, and that's what like an opioid naive meaning never had opiates or not on them regularly, that would be a normal dose that they would give. So if you get an Oxy 30, that's like taking 6 of those little white pills that you would get in the hospital post-surgery. So it's a bigger dose. It could hurt somebody who's opioid naive. Do I think somebody would automatically die from one pill? I think it's possible. I don't think it's probable, but it is possible. Anyway, so I personally believe that Kouri got oxycodone the first time because she never specified to Carmen, according to Carmen, and I know she's, not necessarily super reliable, but based on just all the other evidence, I think she gets oxycodone the first time. She crushes it up. The sandwich had avocado on it. I don't know why I can't say avocado on it. And I think that would have been a perfect place to put it. And it is tasteless to my knowledge. And I think that is why he didn't die from the sandwich, because it was not fentanyl, and it was just, for whatever reason, he might have thrown up, right? Like, I don't know if we know, did Eric throw up? Because opioids really can slow down your digestive tract. And so he may have, his body as a way to like get rid of it, he may have thrown up, which would explain why he didn't die. So he gets sick and he's able to sleep it off, but he's scared enough, he's sick enough that he's telling people like, I might go to the hospital, like I don't know what's going on. And so it isn't just, people say, oh, he could have just had an allergic reaction because he used his son's EpiPen. Well, let me ask you this. I'm 42 years old. I cannot tell you the last time, not even the last time, I have never been like eating something and then after I eat it, like, oh, I get a stomach ache and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm having this allergic reaction to this food, and then slept it off and been like, oh, okay, I'm fine. I must have just had an allergic reaction. I've just never felt that way after I've ate something in my whole life, and nor have I ever been around somebody else, like my husband or my kids, who have like just had a weird reaction to food. Now, of course, have I ever like gotten a little stomach ache after eating something, or like eating too much, or eating like a lot of sugar? Sure. That's not the same thing to me as like being deathly ill to the point where I feel like I need to go to the hospital. And so when people talk about this allergic reaction, like Eric Richins is 39 years old. He would have known about his food allergies up until that point. Not that you can't develop a food allergy at a certain age. I know it is possible, but it's not likely to me. And I'm sure he's had avocado. I'm sure he's had tomatoes. The diner worker went through everything that was on that sandwich, and I'm sure like he didn't just develop an allergy to one of those foods all of a sudden at 39 years old. So I just didn't find that to be, because people were just like, oh, like they're just writing it off like, well, like how do you know he didn't just have allergic reaction? Well, that just doesn't seem like a very reasonable explanation, in my opinion. So we know, like I said, she purchased drugs right prior to that, and we know he didn't die. We also know that that food was left unattended with Kouri. Like, she had access to it. So it wasn't like, you know, she was in a public restaurant or something and she would have had to quickly, like, slip it in his food or his drink in front of a bunch of people. That, to me, would be less plausible than she's actually the one buying it. She's the one that can tamper with it, and then she's leaving it for him with a note on Valentine's Day. So she definitely had the opportunity. And I think, knowing that we know now that Eric ends up passing away about 3 weeks later, it's very reasonable to conclude that the sandwich was unsuccessful. And then we know she reaches out to, Kouri Richins reaches out to Carmen Lauber again. And at that point, she's asking Carmen, hey, I need something stronger. And according to Carmen, she tells Kouri, like, I can get you fentanyl, but, like, that's really hardcore stuff. Like, are you sure that's what you want? And Kouri's like, yeah, get it. So that, to me, tracks with, now we know the next time Eric, you know, is given drugs, because he's got fentanyl in his bloodstream in his autopsy, that he passes away, and that is consistent with Kouri getting something stronger. And that, you know, the dates line up, and that to me is why the attempted murder charge to me was proven with evidence, because it's it is circumstantial, but it's also taking into consideration, like, the fact that he died from a fentanyl overdose, and you work backwards from that knowledge. I think you put the pieces together, and there's a pretty good case that she poisoned that sandwich, or she put the drugs in that sandwich. I personally believe that after she was unsuccessful, another circumstantial part of that is Kouri goes to see her boyfriend, Josh Grossman, and she's lying to Eric and saying she's, like, waiting for a cabinet installer. And Eric thinks she's, like, coming back to care for him. And then, these are all in the text messages, and then Kouri doesn't come back for a long time, and Eric's texting her, like, what the heck, like, where are you, or whatever. And she's, like, made it seem like they had some miscommunication or whatever. But I think Kouri thinks, oh gosh, he's at home dying, so I don't want to go back there until he's, like, good and dead. And, like, she doesn't want to be there when it's happening. Because if she knows Eric thinks she's coming home, then why is she just not going to come home? That's not to say she would never do that, but it just seems a little odd. Like, why would you make it seem like to your husband that you're coming home when when you're out with your lover on Valentine's Day, no less? Another thing that's, again, circumstantial is when Eric mentions, like, he's feeling bad enough to go to the hospital. Like, if that was my husband, and my husband, like, wants to avoid doctors at all costs, and my understanding is Eric was the same way, I personally, if my husband's telling me, like, I really think I need to go to the hospital, this is bad, I'd be like, you need to go to the hospital. Because if you're saying you need to go to the hospital, then you must really be feeling horrible. And she didn't. She was like, you should just take a nap. Like, she was, like, hell-bent, like, you should just lay down. She wanted him to pass away in his sleep, which is typically what happens on an opioid overdose. I heard some people, just off on a little tangent here, I heard some people talking about how they're like, well, wouldn't she have heard him die because he'd be having a seizure and he'd be making all kinds of weird noises? Opioid overdoses are almost always a person just falls asleep and they stop breathing, and what causes death is the lack of breathing, because it slows your respiratory rate down to nothing. And that lack of breathing, obviously, you don't have oxygen, you're going to die at some point. And so it's not allowed, like, there's no, there might be foam coming out of the mouth, but it's not like they're making all kinds of weird noises or anything like that. So it's a very, like, hopefully Eric didn't suffer and he just, like, fell asleep, and that's the least we could hope for, right? So one of the most interesting parts of the Kouri Richins case, and of course I'm assuming you guys have some knowledge or you watch the trial or the coverage of it, I found the phone call with the medical examiner that Kouri made very, very interesting, and that's what I want to talk about next. So it sounds like they get the initial autopsy report, and it's fentanyl intoxication is the cause of death. And then because of that cause of death, the medical examiner ordered some supplemental further testing. And they did that because they wanted more information on the fentanyl, and they suspected it could have been ingested orally. And so they end up testing his stomach contents, which they had obviously saved some of that fluid from his his stomach in the lab, and they were able to test that. And so they did that subsequent testing to kind of see, like, do we think he snorted it? Do we think he injected it? Do we think he had a patch on his arm? There are fentanyl patches that are prescription grade. And is this illicitly manufactured fentanyl? Is this hospital grade fentanyl? It answered a lot of those questions. And so Kouri gets a copy of this supplemental report, and the supplemental report talks about the stomach contents. It tells you how much, fentanyl was found in those stomach contents, how much alcohol was found versus in the bloodstream, and it talks about the fact that there was this other drug called quetiapine or Seroquel also found in his stomach and his blood, and it just gives more information about the toxicology part in particular. So there's a couple little details I noticed in this call that I find extremely suspicious that, like I said, they're just little things, but I found them to be really incriminating. So Kouri calls the medical examiner, and in my opinion, at this point, she gets the results of this subsequent testing, and she's starting to get concerned. Like, oh my gosh, what are they going to be able to tell from this report? I don't think she could help herself, right? Like, she's fixating on it. She's worried about it. She's like, I need to call and ask and see, like, what they say to these questions. And I guarantee you she went into that phone call being like, I'm going to play dumb. I'm going to act like I have no idea. So she calls and she's talking to the medical examiner, and it was a doctor named Dr. Christensen, and he testified in the trial. And so she's asking Dr. Christensen, like, some questions, and one of the first questions she asks him at some point anyway, she's like, or he tells her, or she asks him, well, what's acetyl fentanyl? Because not only did they find fentanyl in his stomach and his blood, or I think it was in his blood, they also found acetyl fentanyl in his blood. And he explained that because there's acetyl fentanyl, then there's norfentanyl. Norfentanyl is the metabolite. So a metabolite just means your body takes the fentanyl and it turns the fentanyl into something that's easier for your body to excrete, is typically the reason why your body would do that. And so that's just meaning that the fentanyl has started to metabolize through the body, doing its usual process. But so that's the norfentanyl. But acetyl fentanyl, he explains, is it's seen in illicitly manufactured fentanyl. And Kouri Richin says, oh, illicitly, what, like, does that mean like from a pharmacy? And the doctor's like, no, not a pharmacy. That means the opposite. Like, that means like a drug cartel manufactured it. And so, Kouri was like, oh, good Lord, or like, whatever. And something I found really interesting about that particular interaction is she pretended not to know what the word illicit meant. But if you go back to the body camera footage from right after Eric passed away, and the police officer is asking Kouri, the police officer specifically asked Kouri, did Eric do illicit drugs? He used the word illicit. Kouri very, matter of fact, very quickly says no. She never said, what's illicit? What do you mean by illicit drugs? I don't know what that word means. She never asks for any clarification, but yet the word illicit is used by the medical examiner on a phone call, and suddenly she's like, oh, does that mean the pharmacy? And it's a total act. In my opinion, it's very obvious to see that she's fishing for this information because she's worried. And then something really telling is he's like, the medical examiner is like, we still don't know how it got into him, in how he was able, like, if he did it himself, etc. And she was like, well, is that something you could ever really find out? And I don't even remember what he said to that, but it's like, why? That just is a very odd question. It's almost like she's saying, like she's hoping he says no, we'll never be able to figure that part out. Which obviously it's like, she knows that it's one of those things, like maybe they can, maybe they can't. It just depends on what evidence comes forth. But the other part that I found really interesting and telling is the doctor. So Kouri asks, she's like, I also see in his stomach that, like, he's got this catipapine, and the doctor's like, quetiapine, and she's like, yeah, quetiapine, what's that? And like she like said whatever the level was, and the doctor's like, oh, like, that's more commonly known as Seroquel, and it's a mental health medication that is sometimes used off-label as a sleep aid. And he's explaining it to her, and she's like, well, what would that mean if he has this quetiapine in his system along with this fentanyl? Like, what do you conclude from that? And the doctor's like, well, usually when we see that, it just means it's like a person who is prescribed Seroquel for some other purpose, like a mental health reason, and they have it in their system simply because that's their prescribed medication, and then they happen to overdose on fentanyl. It's usually not like one's not related to the other. You don't typically see, it's not like people purposefully ingest quetiapine, aka Seroquel, in order to get higher or to, induce a different effect. It's just they might happen to have the prescription for it. Well, you find out after the fact, and I was really happy that that the prosecutor made this argument in closing statements, because it was something I had clocked much earlier that I had not heard them talk about. Kouri Richins was prescribed Seroquel off-label as a sleep aid. That was Kouri's prescription medication. Now, a normal person, and I'm not saying that people can't grieve in other ways. I'm not saying that's an end-all be-all, but in this particular situation, to me, it's very incriminating that on a phone call with the medical examiner, you pretend you don't know what Seroquel is. You're mispronouncing, every medication has a generic name and a brand name. So, for example, the generic name of Tylenol is acetaminophen. The acetaminophen is the actual drug that's in Tylenol. So same thing with Seroquel. The Seroquel is the brand name. The quetiapine is the generic name. And she pretends to not know how to pronounce it. And even when he makes mention of the fact that it's more commonly known as Seroquel, because I guess one could argue maybe she doesn't know it by that generic name, which typically the generic name's on the bottle. So one would think that you would. But let's just, for argument's sake, say she knows it by Seroquel. I'm pretty sure that the doctor did say, like, it's also known as Seroquel. And if that was me, right, and I literally don't know why my husband died, or I know why he died, but I don't know how he got fentanyl in him, and that's my medication, I'm going to be like, oh my gosh, he must have taken taken a pill of mine. Like, I have that medication prescribed to me, he must have taken some. You are certainly not going to sit there and act like you can't pronounce the word and that you don't know anything about it. That is not, like, why would you do that? You know, like, you're not going to get in trouble if your husband, without your knowledge, took one of your prescription pills. Like, your husband did that. That was his own choice. So I thought that particular conversation was super, super, super incriminating. Like, more so than maybe like your average person would. You guys let me know if you thought the same or if I'm making too big of a deal about it. So what I think happened after Kouri did the sandwich poisoning is she asks for something stronger. She's like, this time I'm going to succeed, because she's getting desperate, right? She's like, he's got to be gone by the time I close on the Midway Mansion. Eric was not happy about her closing on that property. He didn't want her to do it. There's a lot of misinformation where people are like, oh, like, yeah, he was out there spreading gravel, and like, that might be the case, but all of the electronic evidence indicates that he still didn't want her to buy it. So I think she needed him to die before she closed on that. And also she had this loan payment she kept extending that the bank was not going to let her keep extending. I think it was like a balloon payment. The last extension was due like March 8th. So she had to die before that date because she was kind of in a mess of trouble over that loan. And she had to, you know, I think too, if you have loans due and suddenly your husband dies, you know, lenders might be a little more understanding. So anyway, so what I think she did is she did a little research about overdoses. And again, a lot of stuff was deleted off Kouri's phone, which that in and of itself is very incriminating. But she had a lot of deleted searches, a lot of deleted text messages. But I think she did research of like what drugs people typically overdose from, which is why I think she asked people for the Michael Jackson drug, because she knew Michael Jackson had died from it. I don't think she knew it was propofol or even cared what it was. But I think she's doing research and she sees like mixing something with alcohol can make it more deadly, which is true. You don't ever want to mix opioids and alcohol together. And that, you know, putting it in a shot is going to get him to, like, with the sandwich, he might only eat half the sandwich, right? Like, he might not finish it. Like, I'm like one of those people, and I know I'm a bigger person, so it might surprise you, but like, I never like sit and eat all my food at once, right? So she doesn't know he's going to eat that entire sandwich. With a drink or a shot, I personally think she put it in the lemon drop shot. You just take the whole thing back and it's done. Like, there's nothing you can do about it once you've swallowed it. So I think that was part of her strategy of, you know, getting a stronger drug, mixing it with alcohol. I think she put the Seroquel in there thinking it's also a sedating medication because she was prescribed it for sleep, thinking, the combination of fentanyl and Seroquel and alcohol would almost guarantee that he dies. And yeah, so obviously her plan worked, unfortunately, and it's a horrible, horrible thing. But, so yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on some of the medical evidence. I want to end the video, or my last topic. I want to talk, so I do follow a couple of defense attorneys who cover cases, and I've been seeing something on a lot of their channels that has been bothering me. And I don't have anything against defense attorneys. They're obviously completely necessary for our system. But what I see is there's these defense attorneys that they cover these cases, and there can be a case with overwhelming evidence of someone's guilt, and they always present the case to their listeners or their followers as if there is reasonable doubt within that case, no matter what. And the way it gets presented is they're presenting it as beyond, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, but they're presenting it as if it's beyond all doubt, because they're putting forth ulterior explanations of the crime that are technically possible, but certainly not reasonable. And I just want people, when they're consuming true crime, I think that the true crime space can be a really great thing. It can put attention on cases that maybe didn't get attention in the past. It can make, attorneys and stuff, if they know that people are looking at a case, they might, if you have an attorney that's maybe a little sloppy, they might do a better job. Like, I think that there are definite advantages, but I think one of the downfalls, or one of the, I call it the pond scum of the true crime community, is you see the online world of crime actually affecting court cases, and it's actually quite scary. And so, for example, the case against Bryan Kohberger, he took a plea deal. That case is overwhelming, pointing to his guilt, just objectively speaking, right? There was DNA of a knife sheath found at the crime scene. There's records of him purchasing the K-Bar knife on Amazon months before. His vehicle matches the vehicle that was at the scene circling prior to entering the residence. He matched the physical description of the surviving roommate. One thing after another, after another, after another. And you have these defense attorneys who will say, well, here's the thing. If the standard was beyond all doubt, no one would ever be convicted of a crime. Because, and they even say this in jury instructions, they'll say something like, rarely in life is anything absolute. And so because of that, the standard is not beyond all doubt. It's just beyond a reasonable doubt. And in my opinion, like, reasonable doubt equates to, if you took, 100 people and you said, okay, and this is an example that gets used a lot, but I think it does the job when trying to explain it. If you went into the bank and it was sunny outside, and you're in the bank for 20 minutes, and then you come back out and the ground is all wet, there's some leaves on the ground everywhere, and you see like 10 people closing their umbrellas that are outside walking around, would you be comfortable making the inference that it had rained while you were in the bank, even though you did not see it rain at all? Like, there's no windows in the bank, whatever. And if your answer to that question is yes, then that would be a circumstantial evidence for you to conclude that it rained, right? You see the evidence of people closing their umbrellas and the wet ground, and you come to an inferred conclusion. The problem with these defense attorneys online is they're not willing to make these reasonable inferences when it comes to circumstantial evidence. And so they are misleading the public in these cases. Even with the Kouri Richins case, you've got, the defense's alternative theory was that Eric was a secret opioid abuser and that he took the fentanyl himself. Well, the problem with that alternative theory, is it technically possible? Sure. Is that reasonable? No. Is it supported by evidence? No. So, for example, if Eric was a secret opioid user, there's a lot of things that come to mind. But number one, the medical examiner did an autopsy and said his organs did not appear that of a chronic opioid user. Number two, there was no known connection that Eric had to a drug dealer. So if we're going to say Eric was secretly consuming opioids, why does he not have some kind of connection on his phone, or, somebody in person, like someone that he works with, comes forward and says, like, I know he was talking to this person. Nothing like that. They didn't find paraphernalia anywhere in the home. Another thing I find extremely telling that makes it completely, very much unlikely that he was an opioid user is, so I personally believe Kouri planted that hydrocodone bottle at his bedside. Hydrocodone is just the generic name for Vicodin. It was from 2016. Eric had knee surgery in 2016 and got that hydrocodone prescription after the knee surgery. They found loose hydrocodone pills down in like their laundry room area in a plastic baggie. I think Kouri took those remaining pills because Eric hadn't finished the prescription back in 2016, and I think she put them in the baggie in the mudroom and then left that empty hydrocodone bottle at his bedside to kind of be like, hey, look at this, or like, it's just odd to me. Like, I would not have a prescription bottle from 2016 sitting on my bedside. You might be able to find, like, I'm not prescribed opioids, but like I have a prescription for metoprolol, for example, which is a blood pressure medication, and I probably have some old bottles you could find, but certainly, like, I'm not using one from 2016 at my bedside. I think it was like, hey, I want you to have opioids on the mind, or, they wanted the cops to think it was significant. The problem is, though, if Eric is seeking out opioids to the point where he's so desperate that he's going to go to the street, he's not going to... There's a bunch of hydrocodone that he either has in a bottle or he knows is in a baggie downstairs in the mudroom. There's no opioid addict or abuser that is going to leave a whole baggie of pills untouched. That's completely inconsistent with that. And another thing is, Eric Richins is a wealthy, white, affluent man who has some genuine, painful medical conditions. He's a stonemason. He's got back issues. He's got chronic Lyme's disease, which is, by all accounts, painful. I have no doubt in my mind that even despite the recent opioid crackdowns, that he could have gone to a clinic and gotten some type of prescription for opioids. Now, they're not giving them out the way that they used to, and that has been unfortunate for some chronic pain patients. It really has, in my opinion, it's gone way too far the other way, but that's neither here nor there. That's for a topic for another day. But Eric could have easily gotten them from a doctor, and let's say he gets them from a doctor, he finishes the prescription, he goes back to get more, and then that time the doctor's like, well, I'm really not comfortable giving them to you again. There would be a medical record showing that Eric went to a doctor and Eric sought out more opioids and Eric was not able to get them, and then you could make an inference that, like, a doctor telling him no might make him want to go to the street. But again, even if you're going to go to the street, you're not probably going to seek out fentanyl. Of course, it could accidentally get slipped into something, possible, but very unlikely. Now, it's unlikely in this case, I mean. So, when it comes to, well, the other thing I wanted to mention is the opioid gummies. See, the THC gummies. What I find really interesting about those is, I don't know if you guys know this, but THC is you can get a positive THC test up to like 30 days from last use, which is why you know, when people use it and then they have to like pass a drug test for work, it's very unfortunate for them, because especially like in your urine and other fluids, it can stay. So it attaches, my understanding is it attaches to like fat cells and like the cells in your like the fat cells in like your brain matter, and that is why it stays in the body so long. So upwards of 30 days you could test positive for THC. Kouri Richins had no detectable THC in his body that they found, none. So Kouri had been on this narrative very obviously for a long time that, oh, Eric was like this big gummy enthusiast. Well, the text messages kind of show that Kouri was the gummy enthusiast, and he kind of would just go along with it. Like, okay, like she would suggest it, and then he'd be like, yeah, that sounds good. We'll, you know, go have a gummy time after work or whatever, or before bed. And I don't judge people. I mean, to me, THC is legal where I live. I don't think THC is a gateway to opioids. Like, I don't believe that. I don't think it makes any bit of, I don't think you can conclude anything from the fact that he did use THC gummies. But if the argument is, oh, he got a bad THC gummy, well, first of all, THC, and even back in 2022, like especially Colorado and some of the surrounding states, like he could have gotten it very easily from a legally manufactured source that was, you know, not being manufactured on the street. So like a dispensary that has checks and balances, that is actually monitoring what's put in their medications or their supplements, whatever you want to call it. And so this idea that he got a tainted gummy doesn't really hold any weight. And I really would even argue that it's unlikely that he was a chronic THC user the way that Kouri's trying to make it out to be. To me, the fact that they kept finding more and more gummies on subsequent search warrants tells me that she bought a whole bunch of gummies and was planting them all around that house. As she started to get more and more focused on in the investigation, she started to think of like ways to make it, you know, look, you know, for the cops to think a certain way with the THC. One other thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about the autopsy, I am almost done here, so bear with me. One thing I found, and again, a little thing, but I found it very incriminating, is when Kouri, when they were talking about how he got the fentanyl in his body, they were talking about how it was in his stomach, and Kouri, or no, they weren't even talking about how it was in his stomach. They were just talking about like how he may have gotten it in his system at all to begin with. And Kouri was like, okay, well, you found it here. Does that mean that he ate it? Does that mean he injected it? And I found it a little peculiar. Now, correct me again if you think I'm making too much of this, that she would say ate it. I think there was a little Freudian slip there. I think she kind of told on herself, because when I think of someone taking a pill, like a fentanyl pill, I don't think of them eating a pill. I think of them swallowing a pill with some kind of liquid. And I think because she had fed him drugs surreptitiously through a sandwich and through a drink, that she had it on the mind of like that he's eating the drugs, right? And that's why she asked the question and used the word eat. I found that to be peculiar, and I found that to be a little bit like I'm telling on myself, even though, you know, like a kind of like a mistake, like a Freudian slip, as I said. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the case as a whole. There were things that were left out of the trial that actually made Kouri look worse. So anybody that's still on the fence about it, two things that come to mind is, I highly recommend you watch the entire Walk the Dog video, or read the entire Walk the Dog letter. There's so much that the judge did not allow into the trial, and I understand why. There are legal reasons for that make Kouri look so much worse. She like basically threatens Kouri Richins' sisters And I love his sisters, by the way. Like, thank goodness for them and their love for their brother. But they actually are threatened in her letter, and the letter's way worse than what was presented in court. So I highly recommend that. You can find it. Just do a simple Google search and click on images and you'll find it. And then there was also a gentleman named Hayden Jeffs that Kouri reached out to, some acquaintance of hers, and asked him specifically for fentanyl. And he was so bothered by it that he told his sister, I think it was his sister, that Kouri had reached out asking for the fentanyl, and he was so upset by it that he never spoke to Kouri again. So his sister could have testified to that, but Hayden Jeffs unfortunately passed away in a motorcycle accident, so any testimony that came from him would be considered hearsay. Therefore, because the sister is even further removed from the actual source, and the source is deceased, so they wouldn't allow that to come in. But I think finding out these other things that were not able to come into trial will make the jurors in particular more relieved with the very clear right verdict that they decided on. So that's all I have for now. Sorry if I was all over the place. My big thing that I wanted to get into with the defense attorneys, and I hope I made my point clear, is the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's not beyond all doubt. So with Kouri Richins, I got into all the reasons why the alternative theory is not it's not a reasonable theory, because it's not supported by any of the evidence. So when people point to that as a reasonable doubt explanation for this case, it's not, because it's not a reasonable conclusion to arrive at when you look at all the evidence. And so I'm kind of tired of these defense attorneys going online and acting like all these cases have, and they'll say, well, that's doubt. Well, that's doubt. Okay, is it doubt or is it reasonable doubt? That matters. It matters so much, because I could say that, Brian Koberger, for example, had a identical twin brother who shared DNA with him, because identical twins have the same DNA, and his mother gave the identical twin up for adoption after Koberger was born, and that identical twin, framed him for the crime because he was angry about being put up for adoption. And is that technically a possibility? I mean, sure, right? There could be things we don't know. That's technically could be true, but is anything pointing to that? Is that a reasonable explanation for the evidence and what we know? Does Marianne Koberger ever said she had, or Brian had an identical twin? Does anybody else ever come forward and said that? Does this person have access to his Amazon account to order him a knife? With none of these things it's not reasonable. It's an alternative explanation. But the way these defense attorneys are operating their channel, they're acting like that explanation I just gave you about Brian Koberger equals reasonable doubt. That's not reasonable doubt. That's a beyond all doubt standard that they're applying, and it's not the way it's supposed to be. So be careful. Don't get sucked into it. I'm not going to get into my feelings on Karen Reed, but I will say, if you think court cases cannot be heavily influenced by the online true crime community, just look at that case. And I understand why it went the way it did. I'm not going to get into it because that we would be here all night. But, and maybe some people think in that case it was a good thing, but there are cases where somebody is really, truly, overwhelmingly guilty of a crime, and there's still these people running around coming up with these reasons why they think the person's innocent, and they're just preposterous, and they're not correctly applying that standard. And I think a huge part of that is they're not looking at reasonable doubt from the correct perspective, because these defense attorneys have unfortunately misinformed them about reasonable doubt. So anyway, all the lights just turned off where I am. I'm in my car. But I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks for listening, and let me know what you want to hear next. Ta-ta!